Another area where you're, unique from other Democrats, I would say, is your embrace of gun rights. And despite the fact that, most gun regulations that are commonly proposed by Democratic lawmakers, like, banning of bump stocks or ending the gun show loopholes, I would consider to be pretty common sense, pretty moderate. That being said, do you think that the Democratic Party has been mistaken in branding themselves as the anti-gun party, especially in a state like Virginia?
Yeah, I really do. Obviously I did 5 years in the Marine Corps. Like if there's one thing that Marines know, it's firearms.
Yeah.
The government makes sure of that. But yeah, I think the Democratic Party has seen a major focus of its efforts on disarmament, which, from an institutional perspective within the Democratic Party, it makes sense for them because there's a lot of big money donors who are very interested in funding anti-gun campaigns. But for the people, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And electorally, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because, when you look at our history, through the history of this country, there are periods of low risk for political violence and periods of high risk for political violence. And I think right now we're in one of those high risk periods. Certainly we've seen it with the Nazi attack on Charlottesville in 2017, which happened here in Virginia. And we've seen it with the Proud Boys attacking DC and Portland and Seattle and cities across the country. And you've got these groups that go around and there's just this mass street violence coming from the extreme right that targets it targets a couple of individuals that have drawn their ire, but usually what ends up happening is they gather around where they think that individual will be, and then they scatter out and they spread that violence amongst the population, right? So they attack targets of opportunity. And we've seen infiltration by the extreme right in the police over the decades. The FBI has even warned about how many Nazis there are in local police forces. We've seen, hell, on Christmas Day, there was, the sheriff's department, whose headquarters is less than a mile away from where I'm sitting right now, had, someone uncovered in their ranks that was posting on Parler about how they wanted to assassinate local politicians. Like this is a very
that's
serious
Rage Against
problem.
the Machine 101, man. Some of those who work forces are the same that burn crosses.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not naive enough to think that law enforcement alone will be able to solve this problem and keep people safe, because that Venn diagram is not two separate circles. As much as I wish it would be, it's not, and it probably never will be. And so, my line in the sand is, there are some measures that keep people safer, like background checks and getting rid of bump stocks. But overall, I am never going to do anything that binds the ability of vulnerable people and vulnerable communities to enact self-defense and community defense, right? When the Nazis come to town to beat people, they should see an armed response from the people. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about, but it's real, because that's the only way we're going to be able to keep people safe, is if the people are keeping the people safe. And you can't do that with thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, I think that's really fair, especially with what we've seen over the summer. Some of the, all black militias that we saw take to the streets in response to the, killing of George Floyd and the murder of, Breonna Taylor and so many others. I think it was a necessary show of force from those communities that, they're not just going to keep taking that abuse, be it from the police or, from racist, Nazis that are members of their own community potentially. So I do think that's a good point and a good way to look at it. One other thing I'm interested that you briefly touched on there is you said that there might be, groups funding the disarmament. Obviously, we often hear about the NRA as being a corrupting influence within DC, on the other side of the aisle, responsible for lack of action on gun control. But I'm interested to hear a little bit more on what you referenced there, where there might be groups or organizations that are actually interested in, the disarmament of the population.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got the pro-gun billionaires, the Koch brothers, your Sheldon Adelsons of the world, your NRA donors that want no regulations whatsoever. And then on the Democratic side, you've got your anti-gun billionaires like your Michael Bloombergs who want no guns whatsoever. And the reality is that, we have to be somewhere in between. There has to be some regulation to make sure that, because there are some people who cannot be trusted with a firearm, but not many. But you also can't take all the guns away, right? Because then that leaves people vulnerable to mob violence from the extreme right. And so, my position that people who Nazis want to kill should be able to stop Nazis from killing them is a position that is common sense, that is supported by the overwhelming majority of the public, but it's
I also think it's a
guaranteed to piss
necessary
off every other politician in America.
Yeah, and I think it's a necessary,
because
not
it threatens their
unspoken
donors from
part
one side
of
to the other.
criminal justice reform, right? If we're going to have defunding the police, if the police are going to be an element of, if we're going to, reduce the police presence in our community, right? You're going to be communities are going to have to, as in a sense, be responsible for policing themselves, which I think provides a lot of benefits that people have talked about. But they're going to have the resources and the tools to do that. And I don't know why people are so much more comfortable giving those tools to, like, the police, essentially just mob rule gang, with a monopoly on violence, whereas essentially you're just democratizing access to weapons of self-defense, which is something that I think Gavin and I would both agree that we're here for. One of the things that I would like to just inquire about with you is something Gavin and I were talking about before the show. As two leftists, as two guys who have never been particularly interested in firearms, I find myself, relatively uninformed on the issue. I can see when I look outside that there's clearly an epidemic of gun violence. We see in America so much more devastation in that capacity, whether it occurs in mass shootings or whether it occurs on the streets of places like our own hometown of Kansas City, which has one of the highest rates of gun violence deaths per capita. I'm wondering, how do we solve that? And to what component is, things like mental health and providing resources and community access to resources part of solving that problem, as opposed to just limiting access to guns?
Well, first of all, I'd like to stipulate that people who are struggling with mental health issues are far more likely to be victims of gun violence than perpetrators. And so, there's this standard right-wing deflection where anytime you bring up violence, they start talking about mental health as a cure for that. But it's not going to be, because you're sort of blaming the victims for what happened to them. And that's something that I'm never going to engage in. But the reality, when you look at the numbers about gun violence, the reality is that the overwhelming majority of gun violence incidents are with stolen handguns, right? But then what does the Democratic Party do? The Democratic Party tries to make it harder to legally buy a long arm. Why? The problem is here, and the Democrats' proposal is here, and they're two separate things. It just goes to show that the political class in this country really is only interested in using this issue as a wedge in elections. They drive on, the Republicans drive their turnout with fear that the Democrats are going to take your guns. And the Democrats drive their turnout with fear that, if the Republicans have their way, then your kid's going to get shot. And the reality is neither. The reality is that the overwhelming majority of people who have firearms are responsible gun owners. There is a problem with handguns in particular being stolen and then being used in crimes. But there have been very, very few policy proposals on the national stage that actually get at that problem.